At 67, I realized fear had controlled my entire life. Not in the dramatic way people imagine. Not the kind of fear that makes you run, scream, or collapse. Mine was quieter than that. It was the kind of fear that dressed itself as caution, as responsibility, as patience, as realism. It spoke in a calm voice. It told me to wait, to be careful, to not make a mistake, to not embarrass myself, to not lose what I had, to not ask for too much, to not expect too much, to not risk too much. For most of my life, I did not call that fear. I called it being sensible. I called it maturity. I called it wisdom. But when you get old enough, if you are honest, you start seeing the pattern underneath your choices. And when I looked back at mine, I saw something that broke my heart. I had not simply lived carefully. I had lived afraid. Fear shaped the way I spoke. It shaped the way I loved. It shaped the chances I took and, even more, the chances I never took. It shaped the conversations I avoided, the boundaries I failed to set, the dreams I delayed until they no longer looked like dreams at all. Fear was there when I smiled and said yes even when something inside me was begging to say no. It was there when I stayed quiet to keep the peace. It was there when I accepted less than I wanted because wanting more felt dangerous. It was there when I told myself maybe next year, maybe later, maybe when the timing is better, maybe when I feel more ready. Fear did not ruin my life in one big moment. It took small pieces of it, slowly, year after year, until one day I looked around and realized how much of me had been negotiated away. That is the hardest thing about fear when it becomes a lifestyle. You stop seeing it. You think this is just who you are. You think, I'm not brave like other people. I'm not built that way. I'm just practical. I'm just not the type. I'm just being careful. But there is a difference between wisdom and fear, and I learned that difference much too late. Wisdom protects what matters. Fear protects comfort. Wisdom makes decisions from clarity. Fear makes decisions from imagined pain. Wisdom may move slowly, but it still moves. Fear waits and waits and waits until waiting becomes a life. I think the roots of it started early. I grew up believing that mistakes were expensive. That embarrassment lasted forever. That disappointing people was dangerous. That security mattered more than joy. That being good mattered more than being free. Nobody said those exact words to me every day, but children don't only learn from words. They learn from tension, from tone, from what gets punished, from what gets praised. I learned to read rooms quickly. I learned how to stay acceptable. I learned how to avoid conflict. I learned how to be liked. And when you become very good at being acceptable, it becomes very hard to become honest. Because honesty risks disapproval. Honesty risks change. Honesty risks loss. So instead, I became agreeable, reliable, pleasant, careful, and all of that looked fine from the outside. But hidden underneath, it was a girl slowly being trained to abandon herself. When I was young, I had dreams. Nothing grand enough to impress the world, but alive enough to mean something to me. I wanted to travel. I wanted to make things. I wanted to build a life that felt expansive, awake, fully mine. I wanted to speak more boldly, love more openly, choose more deliberately. But fear has a way of making your dreams sound childish. It tells you those things are unrealistic. It tells you to be grateful for what you have. It tells you not to complicate your life. It tells you that safe is better than true. So I kept making the smaller choice, the safer choice, the more understandable choice. And because each individual choice looked reasonable, I did not notice the pattern they were creating. But now I do. They were not just choices. They were bricks. And together they built a life with very few risks, very few disruptions, and far too little freedom. Fear was not only in the big decisions. It was in daily behavior. In how I edited myself before speaking. In how quickly I apologized. In how often I imagined worst-case scenarios. In how much energy I spent trying to stay ahead of disappointment. In how often I rehearsed conversations I never ended up having. In how easily I let stronger personalities decide the emotional weather of a room. In how often I chose being understood over being real. That is one of the quiet tragedies of fearful people. They often become experts in emotional prediction. We learn to sense tension before it arrives. We learn to soften our tone, adjust our faces, change our words, make ourselves smaller, smoother, easier to handle. We become very easy to live with and very hard to truly know. I did that for years, maybe for most of my life. I became so practiced at managing discomfort that I mistook it for character. I thought my restraint made me wise. Sometimes it did, but often it just made me absent. Absent from my own desires. Absent from my convictions. Absent from the deeper, riskier kind of living that requires a person to sometimes disappoint others in order to stop disappointing themselves. People often imagine fear as panic, but that was never my experience. My fear was functional, productive, polite. It let me go to work, raise children, keep a home, smile at neighbors, host holidays, and answer questions with a composed voice. On the outside, I looked stable. On the inside, fear was making far more decisions than I realized. It decided how much of myself I could reveal. It decided how long I stayed in situations that no longer fit. It decided which truths I told and which truths I buried. It decided how much happiness I allowed myself to pursue before guilt arrived and called me selfish. I remember so many moments where my life could have bent in a different direction if I had been just a little braver. A conversation I should have had and didn't. A job I should have left sooner. A dream I should have respected more seriously. A boundary I should have set the first time instead of the 50th. A version of myself I kept postponing because I thought one day confidence would magically arrive and make the decision easier. But confidence rarely arrives before action. Usually it comes after. I did not understand that. I thought brave people felt ready. I thought fearless people simply had something I did not. What I know now is that most brave people feel afraid too. They just refuse to let fear be the final authority. I gave fear that authority for far too long. The cost of that does not show up all at once. At first, fear feels protective. It helps you avoid shame. It helps you avoid conflict. It helps you avoid uncertainty. It makes you feel in control. But over time, the cost becomes unbearable. You begin to feel the quiet ache of unlived life. You begin to notice how often your peace is actually suppression. How often your patience is actually delay. How often your kindness is actually self-erasure. How often your stability is actually emotional captivity. And if you do not confront that truth, you can spend decades being praised for your composure while privately grieving the person you might have become. I think one of the greatest losses fear caused in my life was intimacy. Not only romantic intimacy, though that too, but intimacy in the deepest human sense, being fully known. Fearful people are often loved, but not fully known, because being fully known requires exposure. It requires you to show people the truth before you know how they will respond. It requires emotional risk. It requires the willingness to let someone see the raw version of you, not the managed one. I struggled with that. I knew how to be warm. I knew how to be supportive. I knew how to show up. But being deeply open, being unguarded, being honest about hurt, anger, disappointment, longing, that felt dangerous. So even in close relationships, there were parts of me behind glass. And the strange thing is, people may never call you out on it. They may simply adapt. They may love the version of you that feels safest to present. They may stop expecting the deeper truth because you have trained them not to look for it. That is how fear creates loneliness in the middle of togetherness. It is possible to sit at a dinner table surrounded by people and still feel unseen because the real you has spent years behind careful words and acceptable behavior. I also think fear stole a great deal of time, not just through opportunities missed, but through mental occupation. Fear is expensive even when nothing happens. It steals energy through anticipation, through overthinking, through imagined conversations, imagined rejection, imagined disaster, imagined failure. It fills the mind with rehearsals for pain that often never comes. I cannot tell you how many hours of my life were lost not to real danger, but to imagined danger. Not to actual crisis, but to emotional forecasting. And every hour spent fearing life is an hour not spent living it. There came a point, much later than I wish, when the pattern became impossible to ignore. It did not happen in some grand awakening. It happened in smaller moments that finally connected. A conversation where I heard myself say, I just don't want to make things worse, and realized how often that sentence had ruled me. An evening in a quiet room when I felt the weight of all the things I had never said. A look at my own life that was honest enough to notice how much of it had been arranged around avoiding pain rather than pursuing truth. I began to see that fear had not only protected me from certain wounds, it had also blocked me from certain joys. Fear had kept me safe from some embarrassment, yes, but it had also kept me from courage, depth, spontaneity, honesty, and full presence. And then came the hardest question. If fear has been leading me, what would my life have looked like if it hadn't? That question is painful because there is no answer that doesn't hurt a little. You begin seeing the alternate versions of your life in flashes. The conversations that could have changed relationships. The risks that might have opened new doors. The years that could have felt more alive. The joy that might have grown in places where you planted only caution. You realize that fear does not only stop disasters, it also stops expansion. I am not telling you this to glorify recklessness. Recklessness destroys people too. But living afraid is not the same thing as living wisely. Wisdom knows when to protect and when to move. Fear only knows how to retreat, delay, negotiate, and reduce. Wisdom can feel discomfort and still choose truth. Fear feels discomfort and immediately starts bargaining with reality. For most of my life, I called that bargaining maturity. Now I call it what it was, surrender. One of the most painful realizations of old age is that personality is not always personality. Sometimes it is unhealed fear repeated so often it begins to look like identity. I'm just quiet. I'm just cautious. I'm just not that kind of person. Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe some of what you call your nature is simply survival that never got questioned. Maybe some of what you call prudence is actually fear of being seen. Maybe some of what you call peace is just avoidance that became polished over time. When I began to understand that, I also began to feel something I had not felt in years: grief. Not dramatic grief, quiet grief. The kind that sits beside you in the evening and says, look at all the ways you left yourself behind. Look at all the rooms you entered as a version of yourself designed to be accepted. Look at all the times you knew and did not speak, wanted and did not ask, hurt and did not reveal, needed and did not admit, feared and did not challenge it. That grief was hard, but it was honest. And honesty, even painful honesty, is cleaner than a lifetime of self-betrayal. The good news, if there is any, is that clarity still matters even when it arrives late. I could not go back and relive my 20s or 40s or 50s. I could not recover every version of courage I had postponed. But I could finally tell the truth. I could stop calling fear wisdom. I could stop pretending my silence was always virtue. I could stop admiring my own caution as though it had not cost me anything. That is where change begins, not with confidence, but with truth. So if you are listening to me and some part of you feels exposed, don't rush away from that feeling. Stay with it. Ask yourself where fear is wearing a respectable disguise in your life. Ask yourself how many of your decisions come from conviction and how many come from imagined consequences. Ask yourself what truth you keep delaying. Ask yourself what version of yourself has been waiting behind your caution for years. Ask yourself whether your peace is real peace or simply the temporary relief that comes from avoiding what scares you. Because fear will gladly let you live a decent life that never becomes a true one. It will let you be liked, responsible, stable, and quietly unfulfilled. It will let you reach old age with a good reputation and a private ache. It will let you survive your life instead of inhabit it. And the cruelest part is that almost no one will stop you. They may even praise you for it. If I could say one thing to the younger version of myself, it would be this: fear is a poor architect. It may build a life that looks safe, but it cannot build one that feels free. And freedom does not mean the absence of fear. It means fear no longer gets the final vote. At 67, I realized fear had controlled my entire life. That realization hurt me, but it also gave me one last gift. It gave me language for what had been wrong for so long. It gave me honesty. And honesty, even late, is a form of freedom. So if fear has been speaking in your voice, making your choices, shaping your relationships, shrinking your desires, and calling itself wisdom, please hear me clearly. Life does not wait for you to feel ready. It moves while you hesitate. It changes while you delay. And if you do not challenge your fear, one day you may look back, like I did, and realize you were not really protecting your life. You were hiding from it. Don't give fear that much authority. Not anymore.